violate your heart.
You know when you were but a child and forced to go on long road trips with that one douchey kid you didn't like and spend a whole week trapped in some distant, isolated locale like a cabin tent or cheap motel with him? And how you swear you were this close to tearing his fucking eyeballs in the night, but then gradually, through some occult arcane mysticism that you don't understand, you became friends by the end of it, discovering that you're similar in not just all the wrong ways, and rejoicing in your common interests like glam rock and jerking off to World War II films? Well, that's exactly the way I feel about Peacemaker, a show whose balls I was ready to fondle based on how good the thing that spawned it was, but that I almost dropped 2 episodes in after being bored to tears by the apparent virtue-signaling, overweight, lesbian-colored couple and the caricaturing of anything tilted more than 1 inch to the right side of the political spectrum. I've come to the conclusion that I am as broken as Peacemaker himself, having been bludgeoned with the rainbow-colored, over-inclusive, androgynous stick for so long that I've become a radar for detecting this stuff, and activating DEFCON 4 every time the left side of the spectrum so much as sneezes. Alright, Law, could you drop the politics now and talk about the show? That is the fucking show. I swear this thing hits you so hard and there's so much of it early on that you're not left with all that much if you take it away. The characters are all a bunch of depressing D-list dolts, and they all conform to Gunn's signature style of taking what on paper is a simple punchline and then stretching it over a 3-minute fucking scene. The tonal balance errs too far in the stupid direction, with not enough intelligence or heartfelt moments on the other end to keep it nice and level, a balance that the Suicide Squad maintained much better. At least it comes across that way early on. After the first episode, I wasn't even sure I was going to make this review because I genuinely didn't know what I was going to say about it. Having loved Gunn's interpretation of the Suicide Squad, Cena's Peacemaker character, as well as the fact that the show seemed like it was going to build on some of the more significant plot developments in that movie, I was unusually pumped to see this. Those expectations, coupled with all the other shit that assaulted my 2 black dot excuses for eyes, made for a very poor first impression. Sometimes it's tiresome to keep up with the 1-hour improv class that most episodes devolve into. Perhaps I just wasn't in that sort of a mood. The dialogue is just not engaging half the time. Sometimes it's funny, but it's trying too hard, and there's just too much stupid in it. Sometimes the show has jokes, sometimes it has jokes that are stretched for too long, and sometimes it blatantly fills the time with a big pile of nothing.
Why do I care if you saw ants?
Because the circle of life, bro.
What do ants have to do with the circle of life?
They're one of the most important parts of it.
How are ants a more important part of the circle of life than, like, fish?
Is that a serious question?
What?
There are shitloads of ants. How many fish are there?
I don't know, but probably as many as there are ants.
Not in one place at the same time, dude.
Okay, I'm as confused as fuck by this conversation.
Yeah? Well, welcome to the fucking club.
Oh, fuck.
The piece on the jar, no, not the piss on the jar, scene is a perfect example of why I'm so on the funny. Peacemaker establishes a yes or no communication system. Then his sidekick immediately starts off with "what's your favorite color?" which quite literally had me laughing. And that's great, it's short, punchy, to the point humor. It comes out of nowhere and is thus very impactful when it happens without distracting you too much from the story. But then they stretch out that one joke for 2 more minutes, which is like stretching 1 knife of butter over an entire bakery. And that brings us to Vigilante, who embodies every bad thing about Gunn's writing style. He's just too much stupid per square centimeter of human being. It's excessive and unnecessary. I get that he's a horribly adapted individual and there is a tragic sadness to the character, but he is consistently used to mess everyone's day and make nearly all of the more deplorable plot developments happen, to the point where I couldn't help but genuinely despise this character. And of course, as with any piece of fiction, there are minor contrivances, probably a result of the budget slowly waning, and that require a bit of suspension of disbelief. Like, why is the white whale, or whatever he's called, on foot with the rest of these asshats? Weren't you fucking flying a minute ago? Cover more ground, you imbecile. They cast the T-1000 as Peacemaker's father, who's this ultra-nationalist nutjob who walks around on his carpet made of black people and reminisces about the good old days. The show's ham-fisted political stance reached its peak when Peacemaker's dad spouted something about killing communists to the dismay of his son and presumably the audience, the show framing this as a monstrous posture to adopt. Yet my reaction to it was, yeah, it does sound like a good idea. But no need to wave your monocle in indignation, dear viewer, for this is an easy mistake to make. The show, I mean, not me, because 90% of the people who think communism is all that have never actually lived through a communist regime or picked up a fucking history book in their lives, and the remaining 10% who did live through it had special privileges and profited off of the misery of their fellow citizens, and that's the good old days that they miss. And don't get me wrong, he is a ridiculously over-the-top, one-dimensional evil guy, a type of character I usually dislike, but who works well for the purposes of the show, I suppose, and it was very satisfying to see him, get his comeuppance. My only word of warning is that if you go into this strongly tethered to whatever your political ideology of choice may be, then that may or may not hamper your enjoyment of the raucous proceedings. Also, Robert Patrick plays this character a little too well and deserves a medal. I really don't like the Adebayo made for this shit subplot. It's nothing personal, I don't like the audience surrogate character in any media, be it Stargate Universe, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, Morty from Shaman King, or fucking Kagome from Inuyasha. Trying to personify me, the audience member, as a bland, everyday character whom you then empower and validate at the tail end of the show does nothing except make me feel like a bland, everyday character. I don't imprint on these walking tropes, that's not how this works. People imprint on the main characters, which in this case are Peacemaker and Harcourt. Hell, even fucking Economos is more relatable because he's a real character with real struggles instead of the token sidekick who's insecure and doesn't know they can do this, but finds the strength along the way and proudly proclaims that yes, they can do this and Also, her love interest feels like such a pointless addition, not because I'm incapable of resonating with a lesbian woman-on-woman that looks like a man kissing in the living room, boy that was a mouthful, but because this character isn't really a character. She isn't worked into the story at all. She doesn't affect the plot, she's never in danger, has any agency, helps or hinder anyone, or has anything interesting to say. She just doesn't exist as a character, and is there merely to provide some stakes and emotional connection for Adebayo's character. Except you don't need the former because, again, this character is never in danger, nor threatens to break up with her, and you don't need the latter because Adebayo's emotional arc centers on her team and connecting with them, enough to end up risking her life and reputation for them by the end. People like to pick on the damsel in distress tropes of the past and how they're just prizes to be won, but this isn't really that much more progressive by comparison. It's actually regressive, because this damsel isn't even in distress. She's just there, for no reason. People pick on me for picking on movies that add progressive shit for the sake of it, but this is the definition of for the sake of it. It doesn't bother me, but it doesn't add anything either.
Let's go back to Gotham.
Gotham? North fucking Korea is a better destination than Gotham. And yeah, I guess this is how media is nowadays. Whatever story you're telling, it has to go through a thick paste of political poo and come out the other way looking all wrong and stupid. It has to make some kind of political statement, preferably an overall collectivist sentiment. Although, to be fair, there seems to be a plot twist to the political motif at the very end. And in the show's defense, Peacemaker is about as close as you get to a character and a story that has politics naturally baked into it. So if you need to, do it here. No, not on the carpet. What about the good? The good? Yes, you implied that there would be some good stuff to mention. Oh, did I? My mistake. Well, there's some pretty fucking good action, and I don't say that lightly. The end of the first episode, for instance, is a creative, well-executed apartment brawl between two people in their underpants. And overall, there isn't much of anything to complain about on that front. All the fights are believable enough for the genre, they're paced beautifully, and they even employ my old nemesis, the shaky cam, to unexpectedly great effect. It's not too hectic, nor is it used just for the sake of it, and they used it here much better than the Russos did in their films. It actually enhances the action. Strange. Another thing the gun does really well, and which elevates some of the action above the competition, is tension. A very tough thing to pull off when you know from the beginning that most of the main cast won't get liquidated, but he pulls this off rather effectively by yielding tension not from how threatened the characters are, but from what they do. There are quite a few messed up situations that they're placed in, and you genuinely don't know how things are gonna play out. So if I watch the first two episodes like a narcoleptic watches Bob Ross, then the third and fourth ones grip me the way Vader grips his lieutenants, and that balance that I mentioned earlier starts to improve, yielding a bit more sentiment. What perplexes me is that despite all the meandering, the silliness, and the horribly phrased jokes, this series also somehow manages to fit a relevant story in there somehow. People use the term deconstruction a bit loosely nowadays to hide an otherwise lackluster character arc, but this really is a deconstruction of the Peacemaker character, and a decent one at that, which is for the best, because I don't know how you could dedicate an entire show and add any kind of depth to this character without doing that. Anti-Republican sentiments notwithstanding, the show does, in the end, do a half-good job of exploring what makes Peacemaker tick, and every ancillary element like the exquisite glam rock soundtrack comes together to support this. This is what Gunn does best, literarily dissecting damaged people with messed up fathers, and enhancing that through things like music. And for every excessive bit of humor, there's a skit that actually worked for me, like when they do the cliche CIA shakedown with the guy pulling the chair trying to be all intimidating, only for the whole thing to fall apart and devolve into the clumsy 6th grade amateur hour that it really is. That was quite funny, not to mention John Cena's little riff where he name drops about 36 celebrities, real and fictional, that could have made for better targets for a frame job. Which brings us to Cena himself, because while some people might have been confused by the fact that Pisswanka of all people got his own show, after watching it I totally understand why, because none of the others are as entertaining to watch as John Cena. There's something to be said about the extent to which Cena pursues this role. He 100% commits to every line, every joke, every scene, and makes it work no matter how ridiculous the material may get. Despite his age and manliness, he perfectly embodies that kind of youthful energy, ignorance, and naivete that fits this character's background so well, for Peacemaker is, in essence, a kid who never got to grow up. His passage into adulthood was blocked by the horrible things he went through as a child, and so he's this anachronistic 80s action star with rusty old-school values and a Van Halen-style guitar solo accompanying him everywhere he goes. It finds this silver lining between making fun of it, but also paying homage to it. Also, when it comes to the kill count, this show goes hard. A lot of the characters that I thought would survive, or at least last longer in the show, get offed without a second's remorse, and that actually gave me pause a couple times, because it reminded me that axes can quite literally fall anywhere. Some characters die almost too quick sometimes, like I felt that some of them could have been explored a little more, but the show is like,
I don't give a damn!
And I should mention that you should probably watch The Suicide Squad before you watch this, because if you don't, that movie will get spoiled to you, and that would be sad. I also like how everyone's bad at their job, or how the show doesn't just cut to Peacemaker in his house after blowing up a person. There are repercussions, it takes him a while to escape, and the show uses that opportunity to build some levity into it, which is nice. Merv's internal moral battle is quite touching and effective, and once again the show can genuinely be funny a lot of the times. Like that classroom scene where Peacemaker just calls everyone names is some of the funniest shit I've seen in recent memory, and even the post-credit scenes help to endear you to the show a bit more. You remember The Boys, a show seemingly cut from the same irreverent, gory cloth as Peacemaker. I remember watching The Boys when it came out and quite enjoying it. However, I also don't want to see it again, since it is, at the end of the day, an overly edgy, wholly cynical affair whose sole purpose is to shock value you. Whereas this actually has heart in it, and a story worth telling buried somewhere under the gore and overbearing humor, and despite its flaws and my bitching, I'd sooner rewatch the latter rather than the former. Also better than The Bitcher Season 2 in my book, because unlike it, Spring Breaker actually sticks the landing instead of stumbling and shooting itself in the foot near the finish line. And so we arrive at the moment that's probably already been spoiled for you by now, as I imagine that the internet in its entirety is chirping about this one. While this isn't integral to the plot, this segment will get very spoilery, and at the same time would probably sway some of you to watch the show paradoxically. But skip to this time code to maintain spoiler-free virginity. You know, I don't think I've ever experienced a piece of pop culture that made me feel so many different things that run the whole spectrum of good and bad, which I suppose is an achievement in and of itself. I was nearing the final battle of the final episode when my mind started wandering off and thinking about all the jabs that Peacemaker makes at the various more prestigious superheroes, let's say, like Aquaman, The Flash, basically the whole of the Justice League. And I remember thinking that in some alternate dimension where logistics and contracts are simpler, they could probably bring the Justice League in for an actual cameo, no problem. What a paradisiac world that must be. But no, the most we'd probably get is a neck-down cameo like in Shazam. A bit tacky, but still nice to see, I guess. So you can imagine my surprise when 30 minutes later, most of the fucking Justice League actually shows up. And it's a doubly effective moment because at first they're kind of obscured in CGI bullshit shadows, and you can't really see their faces, so you think, okay, it is the Shazam cameo. They're not actually the holy fuck, that's actually Jason Momoa and Ezra Miller, which especially considering that the whole thing is a season-long Aquaman joke, it's very sporting of him to take part in it. And this is where the DCEU, such as it is, shines brightest because, be it out of brilliance or desperation, they're more willing to allow these off-the-beaten-path moments of zaniness than their marvelous counterparts, who are a bit overly tethered to their kid-friendly style guide. This reminds me a lot of that X-Men joke from Deadpool 2. It's the exact same setup, and these are really the only two times where we see PG characters interact with non-PG characters. This would have been the most wasted moment if I wasn't invested in the show by now, but somehow, somewhere along the way, I got really into it, so it ended up being the cherry on top of a cake that was rather annoying to bake, but didn't come out half bad by the end. The thing about Gunn is that his tweets are so batshit, over-the-top, ridiculously confusing that you don't really get a sense of where he stands politically, and when asked about it, his answer doesn't much help either, and that's completely reflected in the show, where on the one hand, Republicans and right-wingers are consistently portrayed like extremist nutjobs, but on the other, some of those same extremists happen to be the chief characters and also happen to talk some sense and call out some of the left's bullshit bullshit, is the very definition of having your cake and eating it, where the show leans heavily on the left until the very end, when the conclusion, the ultimate moral of the story, ends up deconstructing that same left. It's very interesting, actually. I haven't reflected on the show enough to figure out if it does it well or not, but it gave me something to think about, and I did almost grow a crooked smile by the end, so that's something. And I really do mean that, because as soon as the progressivist beatdown started, I thought, oh my gods, I know where they're going with this. They're framing his character as a right-wing extremist nutter, and his whole arc is going to be him learning to be more left-headed and therefore less of a bad guy. But no, while it does partly deconstruct him, the show also vindicates him in the end by sympathizing with the left's overbearing mission of saving the planet, but also personifying it as a bunch of oppressive aliens that want to do it at the expense of humanity's freedom, and takes a page out of the conservatives' book to point out that that's wrong. Perhaps Gunn was trying to deconstruct the very concept of politics itself, and whatever the case, the result is interesting. Much like eating an entire cake, Peacemaker is terribly excessive, but a bit of excess can be an enjoyable thing if you schedule it in, set the proper mood, call up some friends, and factor in the calories, especially with the excellent cherry on top I mentioned earlier. It is at once a critique of glam rock and masculinity while simultaneously reveling in glam rock and masculinity. And if there's one thing Gunn's good at, it's writing actual people, not just walking tropes, so that ensures that you actually get some feels by the end. There's a real sense of camaraderie that builds up between the members of what is ostensibly the worst special tasks force ever put together, and half the fun is seeing them stumble and picking themselves up to try again. Although again, sometimes the show leans too heavily on this, to the point where you can see it coming a mile away. Whatever else you may glean from this horribly unclear review, don't think that the show is unengaging. Despite the annoying start, I was pretty fucking engaged by the midway point. If its goal is to oust the last vestiges of racism from the land by talking about it, then it fails miserably on that front, for as we should all know by now, the best way to deal with racism is to
stop talking about it.
But I don't think that that's what it's doing in the end. I think it's just using politics to make fun of politics. And if all it claims to do is just feed you some fun, entertaining escapism with a surprisingly personal, poignant story as a side dish, then you could do a lot worse than Peacemaker. Best enjoyed with friends. Just kidding, we both know you don't have any. Then you could do a lot worse than Peacemaker. Peacemaker? I really don't like the Adebayo. I really don't like the Adebayo. I really don't like the Adebayo made for this shit, so it sounds the same.